Hello and welcome to Forward Boldly. I'm Christine Niles. So those familiar with my programming know that I have spoken about Nagasaki before, and of course what happened the day the U.S. dropped the atomic bomb in that city, wiping out approximately 200,000 people, 40,000 instantly, but many more in the weeks, months, and years that followed. And that seems to be the extent of what most Americans know about Nagasaki. Many, including many Catholics, don't actually know that Nagasaki had been the center of Christianity, specifically Catholicism in Japan, for centuries. Ever since the 16th century, when the great Jesuit Saint Francis Xavier brought the faith to the island. He arrived there on the Feast of the Assumption, August 15th, 1549, to bring the faith. And 400 years later, many don't know that August 15th, again, the Feast of the Assumption, is the same day that Japan would surrender after World War II. And this was just days after Nagasaki was devastated by the atomic bomb. Nagasaki, of course, was the site of the torture and martyrdom of St. Paul Miki and his companions. They were crucified by the Japanese emperor, and the church commemorates them and their feast day each year on February 6th. St. Maximilian Kolbe, the martyr of Auschwitz, he lived in Nagasaki for 6 years. He established a mission house that survived the atomic blast. He was actually examined by someone named Dr. Takashi Nagai, someone that we will talk about in this interview. He was a doctor who survived the bomb, and he would later die from leukemia as a result of the radiation from the blast. And there's a wonderful book about his life, Song for Nagasaki. It's an incredible book, and I think everyone should read it. Many Japanese Catholics venerate Dr. Nagai as a saint because he taught the path of peace and forgiveness. We'll talk a little bit about this too. He considered Nagasaki to be the sacrificial lamb that ended World War II. A lot of people don't know that approximately 24 Catholics and 2 priests were in Urakami Cathedral at the time of the blast. And Urakami Cathedral was not far from the epicenter of the blast. The Catholics were there making their confessions. The priests were hearing their confessions, and they were immediately killed. In fact, 60% of Japan's Catholic population was wiped out by the bomb, about 8,500 total, either that day or in the days following. And the cathedral itself reduced mostly to rubble. And my guest today, Professor James Nolan, spearheaded the effort to rebuild a new bell for Urakami Cathedral, which was, of course, like I said, destroyed during the bombing. He's author of the book Atomic Doctors. It's based on an archive of notes and files kept by his grandfather, who was a doctor in the Manhattan Project, and one among the first Americans to enter Hiroshima and Nagasaki after the bombing. So, Professor Nolan, thank you so much for speaking with me today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so let's start with the Nagasaki Bell Project. What inspired you to spearhead this effort? And first of all, thank you very much for doing this, by the way, because when I found about it, I was so excited. So thank you for doing it. And what inspired you to do this?
Following my work on Atomic Doctors and inspired by my time in Nagasaki, I've been working on a project about Nagasaki. And so have been several times and was there in May of 2023, interviewing various people, including a gentleman named Moriichi-san. And we had a very nice interview. He's actually one of the descendants of the hidden Christians who lived in Urakami during the years of hiding, and was actually his great-great-grandmother was one of the women who revealed herself to Father Bernard Pettigin in 1865, which is referred to as the discovery of the hidden Christian. So after about over 2 centuries of being in hiding, this is the first kind of interaction with a foreign missionary at that time. So he's a descendant of her anyway. So we had this wonderful interview. At the end of the interview, he explained to me that in the Urakami Cathedral, the right tower had the bell that Nagai and Yamada-san and others had dug up and replaced when the cathedral was rebuilt, but that the left tower had remained empty all these years. And he said, wouldn't it be great if some American Catholics gave us that bell, replaced that bell? And I said, I think that's a wonderful idea. And went back to the United States, investigated what this would involve, contacted a foundry, wrote to the Archbishop of Nagasaki, Archbishop Nakamura, explaining the invitation, explaining our wish to fulfill it, received his blessing, and then set out to raise the money to restore the bell and do research on the original bell. So the bell that we eventually were able to have made is the same size, same basic shape, same essential design as the original bell. There are some changes, but in the main, it's it looks like the bell that was in the original cathedral. So that was the inspiration for the project.
And about how long did it take from beginning to end?
Yeah, so it took. So I wrote to the Archbishop in December of 2023 and 2024, early 2024. I received a wonderful letter from him giving his blessing to the project, and then in the spring of 2024, started raising the money. We raised a total of $125,000, and we told the Archbishop in my original letter. I told him that we wanted to pay for everything, so we would pay for the making of the bell, the transportation, and the installation, and that totals $125,000. So it took a little over a year to raise all that money, and then it was shipped in May of 2025, and then it was installed in July on the Canadian feast day of Saint Kateri Tekakwitha, and Saint Kateri is emblazoned on the bell. And then it was installed, and then on August 9th, at 11:02, exactly the moment that the bomb was dropped in Nagasaki 80 years ago, it rang out for the first time from the tower.
Wow. Were you able to be there for that?
Yeah, I was there for both the installation and the ringing of the bell on August 9th.
Wow. So that must have been very special for you.
It was indeed.
So I'm actually impressed that you were able to raise that much money in only about a year. That's actually faster than what I expected. Was it difficult? I mean, how did you go about raising that money?
So I basically did a couple things. One is I approached individuals, but the main effort was giving talks around the country. So I gave talks mostly in churches, but also at a couple colleges, universities, and I basically told the story of the hidden Christians, of Takashi Nagai, of his remarkable story of forgiveness and peace and rebuilding of Nagasaki, and then about the replacement of the original bell for the right tower. Then this invitation from Morichi-san, and then the invitation for people to give, and people were amazingly generous. And in the end, we had over 640 people donate to the project, and were able to raise the money before I went.
That's wonderful. I was one of the people who donated.
Oh, well, thank you.
Of course. And so when you gave these talks, how did people respond? I mean, were they familiar with these stories? Was it the first time that they were hearing it?
In the main, they were not familiar with the story. They were surprised. They said they didn't know anything about it. They had no idea. I mean, the cathedral that was destroyed was the largest church in East Asia at the time, and people were completely unaware of that. And people were quite touched and moved by the story, inspired by the courage and the faith of the Japanese Catholics and the heroism that they exhibited, and were very keen and took joy in giving to the project.
Oh, well, that's encouraging to hear. So let's turn now to Dr. Takashi Nagai. So I would say that most Americans are unfamiliar with him, most Catholics. I didn't even know about who he was until up about like a couple of years ago when a friend of mine mentioned his name. And he used to live in Japan. He lives here now. But could you talk a little bit about him? Because he was a pretty remarkable person.
Yeah, Takashi Nagai, indeed. So Nagai grew up with kind of Buddhist Shinto influences. He actually had become an atheist, a self-described scientific materialist, but his kind of atheism began to soften when he began to read Pascal. He read Pascal, and then he went to Nagasaki Medical School, and during his time there, he took a room with the Moriyama family near the Urakami Cathedral. And this also began to soften his atheism. And he was actually drawn to the faith through the stories that he was told by the Moriyama family, and also by the community, the community in Urakami, and even the sound of the bells from the cathedral. They lived near the cathedral, and the sound of the bells kind of beckoned him. And, so over time, he was drawn to the Catholic faith. He eventually converted to Catholicism. He ended up marrying Midori Moriyama, so the daughter of the family he was living with, who herself was a very devout, faithful Catholic. He became a radiologist, and he was the head of the radiology department at the hospital in Nagasaki, as well as teaching at the Nagasaki Medical School. And through his practice of X-rays, he actually contracted leukemia. So even before the bomb, he contracted leukemia. And yes, one of the patients he saw was Maximilian Kolbe, and they knew each other during the years that Kolbe lived in Nagasaki between 1930 and 1936. But then, and they had two children, Midori and Takashi Nagai had two children who, after the Hiroshima bomb, they moved out into the countryside with family. But they were in Nagasaki, and the bomb was dropped on August 9th. Nagai was in the hospital, and a blast threw him about 10 feet. He had the right temple severed, and of course, he got more radiation exposure. Midori was closer to the epicenter, and she was killed by the bomb, as were 8,500 Catholics. And as you pointed out in your introduction, about 24 parishioners who were going to confession, as well as 2 priests who were hearing confessions. So Nagai's response is remarkable. He responded with great courage and heroism in caring for the hibakusha, the victims of the bomb. He set up a relief mission where he cared for those who were injured, even while he himself was injured from the bomb. And he eventually became bedridden because of his injuries. But even as he was bedridden, he wrote, he painted, he wrote poetry, he met with people, he corresponded, and he wrote a number of books, some of which became bestsellers, including The Bells of Nagasaki. And he would give the proceeds to help rebuild the cathedral, rebuild the community, rebuild the city. So he's a remarkable person. Perhaps one of the most notable things that he did, he was asked by the Archbishop of Nagasaki to give a message at the Requiem Mass for the victims of the bomb. So this was in November of 1945. And he gave a message that people still talk about today. I mean, it's still something that people talk about and remember. And in it, he talked about, he offered a narrative for how to make sense of the bomb and the suffering and the death that resulted from it. And he thought deeply about this even before the Requiem Mass, before he gave his eulogy. And he said several things. And one of the things that he said was that yes, that we could understand this as a holocaust, a peace offering. Hansai is the Japanese word of an offering to end the war and bring peace. And that those who died, therefore, died for this purpose and could be seen as sacrificial lambs. He also talked about the notion of God's providence. Setsuri is the Japanese word. And the notion that within God's providence, we could recognize this as something that, though evil in itself, could bring about good. And those are two of the things that he talked about. And he said, because of this, we could therefore give thanks to God for the bomb, and that we could rejoice in this. And it's a message that he carried on with, that he kept emphasizing to people. There's a wonderful story of a friend of his named Yamada-san who lost his wife, lost his parents and lost 5 kids from the blast. He had been himself in the military on an island, so he wasn't in Nagasaki, but when he returned, his whole family had been killed. And he was angry. He went to Nagai, and Nagai said, the best of shots, the way we need to understand the bomb is that it's within God's providence and that we can give thanks. And Yamada, he and Yamada were good friends, and the two of them are the ones that, along with some others, went up to the cathedral on Christmas Eve, 1945. And one of the bells had been completely blown off and destroyed, and another one was presumed to be in the rubble, deep in the rubble. So Yamada and Nagai and others dig up this bell, and they do it on Christmas Eve. They pull it up with a block and tackle and put it on a tripod, and they're not sure if it's going to ring, but incredibly, it's completely intact. And so they were called Angelus bells. And so on that evening, Christmas Eve, 1945, they rang out the Angelus bells. And because the city was completely destroyed, there was nothing to block the sound. And so it was a sound of great comfort to the surviving Catholics in the area as that sound rang out. And I've interviewed a number of people, including Yamada-san's son, who's now a priest. I also interviewed a man who witnessed Nagai and Yamada digging up the bell. And he told me in my interview, he said, I'll never forget that sound. I have forgotten many things, but that sound, it was so beautiful. I will never forget that sound. And so in a certain sense, in fact, Moriichi-san, when he invited me to give the bell, he said, do you know Nagai's book, The Bells of Nagasaki? I said, yes, I've read it. It's a terrific book. He goes, well, it was only just one bell. And with the replacement of this second bell, it really now is the bells of Nagasaki, and they ring together. And so it's been a beautiful project to be a part of.
Wow, that's amazing. That is amazing. I can't even imagine what the Catholics of Nagasaki must have felt when they heard that bell ringing just in the midst of all that devastation. And you mentioned Dr. Nagai's message about this Holocaust. That part touched me more deeply than anything that I read about him, because I believe that's the heart of his message. Just touched me so profoundly. But I actually want to read his words here in this short paragraph. Quote, "It was not the American crew, I believe, who chose our suburb. God's providence chose Urakami and carried the bomb right above our homes. Is there not a profound relationship between the annihilation of Nagasaki and the end of the war? Was not Nagasaki the chosen victim, the lamb without blemish, slain as a whole burnt offering on the altar of sacrifice, atoning for the sins of all the nations during World War II?" I remember when I read that, I was just so thunderstruck because I never thought of it that way before. But it's such a supernatural view.
Yes, it's remarkable. In fact, he has, among his paintings, is this beautiful drawing of the mushroom cloud of the atomic bomb. And standing on top of it is Midori holding her rosary beads. And so it's just an example of this notion of it being a peace offering, Holocaust. And also, incidentally, when he finally went back to his home after immediately helping victims of the bomb in the area of the hospital, he went back to his home and he found, only the bones of Midori left because she'd been killed by the bomb. But within her bones were the melted remains of her rosary bead, which you could still see. They're in the little museum next to Nyakoto. Nyakoto's Nagai's house. It means love thy neighbor as thyself. And there's in the museum, you can see Midori's rosary beads. Yeah.
Well, I mean, all the more remarkable that he could take this attitude of forgiveness because he had lost so much.
That's right.
And there's that saying, Hiroshima rages, Nagasaki prays. It seems like Dr. Nagai's legacy has profoundly impacted Nagasaki, even up to this day.
Yes, I think that's really true. And they people still say that. Ikari no Hiroshima, inori no Nagasaki. And I think that there are attitudes in the two places that have kind of continued. And the clear attitude in Nagasaki is one of although there are exceptions, of course, but the overall attitude is one of kind of forgiveness and peace, reconciliation. That's the dominant attitude, and I think that Nagai certainly articulated that narrative, but he wasn't making it up. I mean, it was an attitude that was endemic to the community itself, and you see that in some of the research I've done. That the victims of the bomb had this attitude of prayer, of forgiveness, and it's an attitude that one finds throughout the history of the persecution of the hidden Christians. So, for example, you mentioned Paul Mickey. When Nagai himself was confirmed, he took Paul as in Paul Mickey as his confirmation name. And Paul Mickey, when he was on the cross on Nishizaki Hill, which is not very far from the epicenter of the bomb, incidentally, when he was on Nishizaki Hill, he cried out, "I forgive Hideyoshi Toyotomi and the others who are responsible for my execution." He said, "I forgive." Yeah. So my point is, there was a long history of persecution and suffering, and a response of forgiveness and hope and endurance.
Amazing. I've never been to Nagasaki before, but it's definitely on my bucket list one day to go visit. Let's turn now to your book, Atomic Doctors, because this is something I'm in the middle of reading. It's absolutely fascinating. It's very eye-opening. There are things that I learned that I never knew. For instance, I never knew the level of deception that was employed after the bomb and the way that some of these people whitewashed the suffering of these Japanese after the bomb. I remember being really amazed. You mentioned the testimony of General Leslie Groves and how he just flat out lied to the government about the deaths of these Japanese, and that they actually didn't suffer very much from the radiation, and that in fact, they even had a pleasant death. And my jaw just dropped when I heard that. I couldn't believe that. Could you talk a little bit about that? I mean, why was there so much deception?
Well, just to that point, that was also in November of 1945, where Groves testified before Congress, and he was asked about the issues of radiation, and he used the doctors, including my grandfather. He used their vocation, I suppose you could put it, as cover to basically mislead people about the effects of radiation. And in that testimony before Congress, he said, there's absolutely no residual radiation on the ground in Nagasaki. That was simply not true. When they went into Nagasaki and into Hiroshima, they found low levels of residual radiation on the ground. And incidentally, Nagai did too. Nagai, as a radiologist, was pretty well schooled in kind of physics and radiation, and he himself did a kind of study on the effects of radiation in Nagasaki. So they found radiation. They also found that people were continuing to die from radiation exposure, and quite a few were dying. People who had no other injuries, no blast effects, no fire burns, but simply exposure to radiation were dying, and they witnessed that. They witnessed that when they were there, and they submitted a report to Groves, and even the report, I would say, didn't capture the extent of what they saw. They were only there for 6 weeks. Nevertheless, they saw it, and they reported what they saw, and they did talk about people dying from radiation exposure. And Groves said, that very few died from radiation exposure, and that those who did so from the initial blast. There was just an accident if someone somehow, died later because of radiation exposure. And he said, and the doctors tell me that those who did die, that it was a very pleasant way to die, which was just patently false. In fact, even at that point, there had been an accident at Los Alamos. One of his own scientists had an accident and been exposed to radiation, and it's an excruciating death. It's very painful. And
would you mind talking about some of the effects for those who might not know?
Yeah, well, and again, in this report, it's detailed, the kind of effects. But what happens from radiation exposure, often their hair falls out. They get these purple dots. They have severe diarrhea. White blood cell count is lowered, and so oftentimes their gums would bleed and things like this, and it progressed. In some cases, if the radiation exposure wasn't too severe, they could recover. But in many instances, they would eventually die depending on how much exposure they received. And it was very painful. It was a very painful, like in the nuclear accidents in Los Alamos, they actually took photographs of the scientists who died from this, and you can see that their hands that had been exposed begin to swell up, and they, in this case, they were able to give them morphine to deal with the pain, but it's not, it's far from pleasant.
Why did he lie like that?
Well, I think that it had been basically agreed upon that chemical and bacteriological warfare was wrong, and radiation exposure could be put in the same category justifiably, and didn't want that. There would be a kind of supposed moral culpability if that were the case, and he was also Groves was very keen to see the nuclear program continue. And so if there's this kind of information coming out about the effects of a nuclear bomb and then the conclusion that this is somehow morally unacceptable, it could prevent the further development of nuclear weapons in the future. So I think that was a concern as well. And so there was a very deliberate effort to stop the so-called propaganda coming out of Japan of ongoing deaths from radiation exposure.
Wow. Now, something else that your book mentions that also disturbed me were the plutonium experiments and how human beings were used as guinea pigs, basically to test out the toxicity of plutonium, and they didn't even know it. So for those unfamiliar with this, could you also talk about that?
Yeah, it's very awful. And what happened is in Los Alamos, you had scientists working for the first time with this, radioactive material. So uranium-235, plutonium-239, and they just didn't know what effects these materials would have on the human body. And there were a couple accidents, and one in which someone inhaled some plutonium or ingested some plutonium. And so Louis Hempelman, who was a friend of my grandfather's and who worked in the lab with the health group in the lab, they decided that they wanted to kind of figure out what the effects were on the human body, and how long it would take to excrete the plutonium if it was ingested or put into the human body. And so they set up these experiments at several hospitals around the country. Oppenheimer signed off on it. In fact, Oppenheimer's only stipulation was that these tests not be done in Los Alamos. So they were done in Oak Ridge, Rochester, University of California. And people who were ostensibly terminally ill were injected with traces of plutonium, not told about it, not asked for consent. And then doctors took their stool and urine samples, and in some cases even bone samples, and sent them to Los Alamos to be tested to determine how long it would take for the human body to excrete plutonium. So it was a terrible experiment. In some cases, the people were not terminally ill, and in some cases, we don't know exactly, the effect that it would have. But in this case, that there was the knowledge that these doctors were injecting something that was harmful. And you think about the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. Well, they were doing harm knowingly and not even letting the patients know what was happening to them. So it really is a terrible thing. I have to admit that I was quite pleased to discover that my grandfather had no direct involvement in this particular effort. Yeah.
I mean, it was eventually exposed, correct?
It was exposed, yeah, but not until the 1990s, and it was investigated by during the Clinton administration and by the Secretary of Department of Education, and uncovered and they'd done some rather extensive research, and it was determined that even by the standards at the time, what they were doing was fundamentally wrong.
Wow. I guess the big question here, of course, the big debate is the morality of the bomb. And I've engaged in a few debates and arguments with people online over this. And the argument that I almost always hear, including from some Catholics, is that it was necessary to end the war, that it saved more lives than it killed. And of course, that's a utilitarian argument. I mean, it's basically saying we do this evil in order to bring out greater good. And it's the exact opposite of what the church has always taught, which is that you cannot do evil in order to bring about good. So I'm just wondering, have you engaged in discussions with people about the morality of the bomb whenever you talk about Nagasaki?
So in the book, I raise these moral questions, and in the sense of I look at the way people discussed it, including my grandfather and Stafford Warren and a couple of the other American doctors stayed up late one night in the outskirts of Hiroshima with the Japanese doctors, and they had a long conversation about the morality of the bomb, which I would love to have the transcript for that. But Stafford Warren in particular talks about it. So I address it in these ways. You also had the German Jesuits who were in Hiroshima, and in Father Seamus's kind of testimony of the pretty heroic work that they did caring for the victims of the bomb, he raises these questions. Does this fit within just war theory, for example? And so I do it in that way. I kind of raise these questions in the book without getting into the kind of moral philosophical kind of articulation of the views. But I think a couple things. One is often the question is, was it necessary and was it justified? Right. Those are the two questions that are asked. And the question about the necessary is what you said, right? People say, well, it saved American lives and it ended the war. That's how people will put it. It saved American lives and it ended the war. And even that is somewhat questionable, right? It's also often a false dichotomy that the only alternatives were that we would invade, and it would be a costly land invasion that would cost hundreds of thousands of American lives, or we drop the bomb. But in retrospect, the United States Strategic Bombing Survey went into Japan and did a very extensive examination and survey, and they determined. So this is a government-sponsored entity that went in, and they determined that Japan would have surrendered by December, as early as November 1st, without the bomb, without a land invasion, and without Russia declaring war on Japan. So arguably, they didn't have much of a navy or an air force left. The Emperor Hirohito was, reaching out through the Russians, trying to negotiate an end to the war. His only stipulation was that he remain emperor, which we ultimately allowed anyway. So I do think there are questions about that common narrative that it ended the war and saved American lives is questionable. That's not to say that people in the moment didn't really think that. I think they did really think that in the moment, but retrospectively and with further information, I think that's certainly questionable. The other thing I would say is that in terms of just war theory, because of the nature of a nuclear bomb, it necessarily will result in the indiscriminate killing of civilians, which is not justified within just war theory. And then the other thing I would add is that it is a unique weapon in that the effects of radiation carry on, not just for days, but for decades. I mean, people continued to contract and get cancer, different forms of cancer, years and decades after the bomb was dropped because of the radiation that induced the kind of other radioisotopes in the human body, and then eventually would lead to cancer. So, for all those reasons, I think that the dominant narrative, at the very least, needs to be seriously questioned.
I agree. And of course, there were very high-ranking generals and admirals who, at the time, disagreed with dropping the bomb. You have General Eisenhower didn't agree with it. A number of others as well, including General MacArthur.
So, and a number of the scientists who made the bomb were very much, but a number of the scientists who made the bomb, particularly a group of scientists at the University of Chicago, actually signed a petition, 70 scientists urging the president to carefully consider what was going to be done, and urging, for example, dropping a bomb on a deserted island to show the Japanese the power of it, before, giving them the chance to see the power of this thing before it was dropped on the civilian population. So there were voices of caution even at the time, but the momentum of the project and the kind of the clear interest in going forward with it, with people like Groves, kept it going.
Right. In my discussions with these people, I often find that it's much easier for people to justify using the atomic bomb when the individuals who are killed, the victims, remain sort of this abstract mass, halfway across the world. They're distant from me. They have no personal connection to me. It's very easy to sort of justify mass slaughtering all of them. But when you start reading stories like Dr. Takashi Nagai's, or some other accounts I read that were very touching to me, for instance, you might know about these, but some of the victims in Nagasaki were these girls at a girls' school in Junshin run by Catholic nuns. And the girls had been taught to repeat the refrain, "Mary, my mother, I offer myself to you." And many of these girls ended up dying in the blast. And those were the words that they had on their lips as they were dying. "Mary, my mother, I offer myself to you." And we also have these Catholic nuns.
Nagai himself heard about that. And that was in part the inspiration for his whole notion of Hansai, of a Holocaust. Was that and another example were part of what played into his thinking, was hearing that story. Yeah.
Amazing. And then you have the Catholic convent, where 27 nuns were killed, but their voices were actually heard from under the rubble singing hymns of praise to God as they were dying. And so you hear stories like that about anybody, but, especially about your fellow Catholics. And it makes it, you really have to start thinking hard about whether or not these people deserved to die. And of course they didn't.
This is kind of interesting. A woman in the United States read one of Nagai's books and wrote to him. And one of the things she said was, I in reading your book and giving the sort of accounts that you're talking about, she said, I felt for the first time responsibility as an American for what we did. And what's interesting about that is that Nagai is never accusatory toward the United States. And sometimes he's actually been criticized for that. I mean, he really did have a message of forgiveness. And so he didn't, and he's sometimes accused of, exonerating Americans. And what's interesting is that he was simply giving accounts of what happened to people, not in an accusatory way. And yet that was the response from the American who read it, which is similar to what you just articulated. I felt responsibility for the first time when I read these accounts.
Yeah, and we should feel responsibility. Such a fascinating discussion. Could you please let people know where they can buy your book?
Okay. Thank you so much. So Atomic Doctors was published with Harvard University Press, and it's in bookstores, but you could also buy it on Amazon and buy it directly from Harvard, as well. And Barnes and Noble, those are places you can get it. Yeah.
Wonderful. And do you plan on making any future trips to Japan?
Well, I was just there this summer, as I mentioned. And yes, I will be going back at some point. I'm working on a book about Nagasaki, and I'm about halfway done with it. And so at some point I will go when I'm near the end to just tie up and confirm things and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I look forward to reading that when it comes out.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Nolan, for speaking with me today.
Yeah, it's very nice talking to you. Thank you for having me on.
And for all of you watching and listening, thank you so much. I hope that you have learned from this discussion. If you're able, please go find Dr. Nagai's book. You can probably find it on Amazon. It's very difficult to get a copy of The Bells of Nagasaki. I wasn't able to get a copy, but you can read Song for Nagasaki, which is actually very good. It's about his life. I encourage you to find that. I also encourage you to read Atomic Doctors. It's fascinating, it's eye-opening, it's heartbreaking, it's maddening, but it's all this information that as Americans we really need to understand. All of this, we really do. And we do need to take responsibility for what happened back then, because what the U.S. did to Hiroshima and Nagasaki completely and totally changed the course of their history. And I think that's kind of an understatement. So, thank you all for watching and listening. In the words of Saint Joan of Arc, in God's name, forward, boldly.